Sadio Mane, the Champions League champion, the icon of Africa, more than a decade of persistence at the pinnacle of world football. A man who has redefined the meaning of humility in an era where fame often goes hand in hand with showiness. From the barefoot runs on the dry, cracked ground of Bambali to the dazzling nights at Liverpool FC, he has conquered the biggest stages on the planet. With discipline, faith, and an iron will that never allowed him to submit, millions of people admire him as a symbol of strength, of compassion, of a heart always turned toward those who have been forgotten. But behind that glory is a story that is not at all glamorous, but full of lingering wounds. A childhood that was not only poor but also marked by loss far too early. A father who passed away when he had not yet had time to understand what a support was. Those long days of hunger and rejection, in a strange city that refused to see him, nights sleeping temporarily, mornings with nothing but fragile hope. Those years where dreaming was not something encouraged, but something seen as a mistake. And then, when the world began to call his name, when the titles came one after another, something else also grew silently. Not pride, but a fear that never left, a feeling that everything could disappear at any moment, that the past was still waiting for him behind, not as a memory, but as a constant reminder. He ran not only to score goals, but to keep distance from the very place he once belonged to. He gave not only out of kindness, but because he understood clearly what it was like to have nothing to receive in return. And now, at the age of 34, when his steps begin to slow down, when his body is no longer limitless as before, when the lights are still bright, but time no longer stands still, the question is no longer what he has achieved, but what still remains. What has followed him through every match, every title, every silent bow of the head? What is the thing he has never spoken out, but is always present in the way he lives, the way he sees the world, the way he stays away from all the glamour that he could have enjoyed? Because there are people who never truly leave the place where they started, and there are stories that do not end with success, but only continue in a different form. Quieter, heavier, and truer than anything the world has ever seen. Before continuing, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to accompany the story of a man who has walked through darkness without ever losing himself. And if you can feel the silence behind that halo of light, please stay, because the next journey will take you back to where everything began, where a little boy learned how to endure before he knew how to dream. Bambali is not a place where people are born to dream. It is a place where people learn how to endure before they even understand what living is. A small village deep in the Sadio region of Senegal, where the red earth is hard and dry under the long sun, where the roads are not roads, but only paths marked by footprints through the years, where electricity is unstable and clean water is not always available, where every morning does not begin with hope, but with a very simple but heavy question: what will we eat today? And in that space, Sadio Mane grew up like many other children, without protection, without choices. Only family was the only thing that kept everything from completely collapsing. A large family sharing the few meager portions of rice, the cramped sleeps, the rare moments that could be called peace. And at the center of it all, the father stood there like an irreplaceable support. Not because he could give them more, but because he was the only one who made that world meaningful. An imam, a man of faith, strict, quiet, but steadfast, the one the whole family looked to when everything became too difficult. The one that the little boy, Mane, even though he did not fully understand, still felt as a presence that could not be lost. But life in Bambali did not keep anything for long, and then, one day, without any warning, without any explanation, that father left, leaving a void that no one could name. Not a noisy moment, no loud crying, only a spreading silence, as if a part of the world had suddenly disappeared. And, for a child who had not yet understood what loss was, That was not only the departure of a person, but the collapse of the entire sense of safety. It was the first time he realized that everything could be taken away without reason. And the cruelest thing was not losing his father, but losing him too early, when he did not have enough words to understand, did not have enough time to prepare, did not have anyone to teach him how to face the pain, and therefore that pain did not disappear. It only settled down, silently, heavily, becoming a part of the way he saw the world. In the prolonged silence, in the moments when he stood still longer than the other children, as if trying to understand something that no one around could explain, that there are things that once lost will never return. From then on, Bambali was no longer just a place of poverty. It became a place where everything was fragile, where every passing day carried the fear of loss, where a child began to learn not to place too much faith in the future, because the future had never been certain. And in those long afternoons, while the other children still ran on the dirt field, laughter rang out and then dissolved into the hot air. There was a boy who gradually became quieter, not because he did not want to be happy, but because he had begun to understand that joy did not always stay, that everything could disappear at any moment. And right from those days, something had formed inside him, not strength in the way people usually think, but a very deep, very quiet form of endurance, a habit of carrying pain without speaking it out, a way of existing that did not need anyone to see. And even though later the world would call him an icon, no matter how brightly the lights shone, the memory of those days, of the wordless death of his father, of the void that could not be filled, would still remain, not noisy, not clear, but heavy enough to go with him through every run, every match, every title, like a part of the story that no one sees but is always present. After the day his father passed away, there was no conversation in that small house. No one sat down to explain to a child what loss was. No one told him that the pain would ease. Everything was just a prolonged void, a heavy silence covering every meal, every evening, every avoided glance in the family, as if not mentioning it would make everything less painful. But in reality, that very silence made the pain deeper, harder to name. And Sadio Mane, when he was still too small to understand what was happening, had learned to accept that silence as a natural part of life. He did not ask, did not cry, did not seek answers, because no one around him did that. And over time, not speaking out emotions was no longer a choice but became a habit, a natural reflex when facing anything difficult. In the following days, life continued as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything was different. The mother became busier, the burden heavier, the other siblings also immersed in their own worries. No one had enough time or ability to help a child understand what even they themselves could not understand. And therefore, Manier gradually became quieter, not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not know where to start, did not know how to express his feelings. Every time he felt empty, every time he remembered his father, every time he noticed a silence in the house that had not existed before, he only stayed silent, looked away, or left that place, as if not facing it would make it disappear. But it did not disappear. It only accumulated little by little, like something growing heavier inside, without a clear shape, but always present, always affecting the way he saw the world, the way he reacted to everything around him. In the long afternoons in Bombali, when the sunlight gradually faded and the air became gentler, the other children still ran and jumped, laughed and played, but Manet often stood outside more, observed more, participated less, not because he did not want to, but because there was an invisible distance between him and the rest of the world, a distance created not by circumstances, but by emotions that were not spoken. And when there was no way to release it, he began to learn how to carry it with him, like a part that could not be separated. Over the years, that silence was not only a reaction to pain, but became the way he existed, a way to protect himself from things he could not control. If he did not speak it out, then he would not have to face it. If he did not show it, then he would not be hurt more. And right in that process, a habit formed, the habit of enduring alone, not seeking help, not expecting anyone to understand, just simply continuing, day by day, step by step, no matter what the inner feelings were. This did not make the pain disappear, but it made him steadfast in a very unique way, a steadfastness that did not come from external strength, but from having gotten used to having no one there to share with. When he grew a little older, when he began to perceive the world around him more clearly, Mane did not become more open. On the contrary, he withdrew even more, because the more he understood, the more he realized that there were things that could not be changed, there were losses that could not be compensated, and there were questions that would never have answers. The silence was no longer just a reaction to a specific event. It became a part of who he was, in the way he thought, in the way he communicated, in the way he built relationships with those around him. Even when he stepped out of that small village, even when he began to come into contact with new opportunities, that still did not change, because it no longer depended on circumstances, but had become his nature. And even later, when the world saw him as a man not subdued by anything, few realized that most of that strength was built from this very silence, from the years with no place to express emotions, from the times he had to face pain alone without guidance. And even though that helped him go further, helped him not easily collapse, it also carried a price, a distance that always existed between him and the world, a part inside that was always separate, always keeping back what could not be shared. And perhaps that is why, even when standing among millions of fans, even when the lights illuminated every step, there was still something in his eyes that did not belong to the present, but belonged to those very distant days where the silence began and had never really ended. The silence did not make the pain disappear. It only made everything harder to talk about, and in that empty space, when life gradually returned to the familiar rhythms of Bambali, something else began to grow inside the little boy, Sadio Mane, a dream that even he himself did not know what to call, because in that place, people did not talk about dreams. They talked about responsibility, about the paths already laid out, about having to become a person like his father had been, a person of faith, of stability, of the values that the community believed would keep the family from being swept away once more. And therefore, when Mane began to spend more time with the ball, when the afternoons were no longer just observation but became runs, clumsy touches of the ball on the hard ground, that was not seen as something good. It was viewed as a distraction, a path with no future, a choice that could make everything worse in a life that was already too fragile. The family did not say that with loud anger, but with glances, with gentle but heavy enough reminders that he needed to be more realistic, that life did not allow vague choices, that there were things more important than running after a ball. And in each such sentence, Mane began to feel more clearly a conflict that he had not faced before. One side was the familiar feeling of responsibility, of not disappointing anyone, of staying within the limits that everyone around accepted. And the other side was something new, vague but strong, a feeling every time he touched the ball, every time he ran, every time he forgot everything else for just a few short minutes, that was not simple joy, but a form of freedom he had never had. But that very thing made it harder to accept, because to pursue it, he had to face going against what his family wanted, had to accept doubtful looks from the community, had to step into a path where no one could guarantee anything. And for a child who had already lost so much, trading the little safety left was not an easy decision. There were days he tried to give it up, tried to do what was expected, stayed more, helped more, stayed away from the ball as if that was the way to make everything simpler. But then when night fell, when everyone was asleep, when no one was looking, he would find empty spaces, small corners, where he could play alone, not for anyone, not to prove anything, only to feel again the feeling he could not name, And those very moments made the conflict clearer, because he knew that no matter how hard he tried, he could not completely give it up. And the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger it became, like a part of himself that was finding a way to exist. Over time, the choice gradually became unavoidable, not because he was certain about the future, but because he had no other way to continue living with himself. The decision to pursue football did not come from confidence, but from accepting risk, accepting that he might fail, might lose everything, but still had to try, because not trying would mean living his whole life with a sense of lack that he could not explain. And when that decision formed, it did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it brought greater worry, because now every step had weight. Every failure could become proof that he had been wrong. Every rejection was not only a lost opportunity, but a reminder that those who had doubted might be right. But even so, he still continued, not because he believed he would succeed, but because he could not return to the starting point and pretend that the dream had never existed. And in that journey, amid the pressures, the looks, the words, something gradually became clear: that this dream was not only a personal goal, it had become a part of the way he faced the past, a way not to be trapped in the silence that had followed him from very early on. And even though the road ahead had no guarantees, even though no one stood fully behind to support him, he still moved forward, step by step, carrying both fear, responsibility, and the fragile belief that somewhere this could lead to something else. Something big enough to justify all that he had had to trade. That decision did not come like an explosive moment. There was no specific day when everything became clear. It came slowly, silently, accumulating through each long afternoon in Bombali. Through each time, he tried to ignore the ball but still returned to it. Through each doubtful look that he could not forget. And then one night, nothing special happened. No final word, no big argument, only a very clear feeling that if he did not leave now, he would never leave again. And Sadio Mane, at that time still just a boy who had not really understood the outside world, chose to step out of everything familiar, not with confidence but with a familiar silence. Like the way he had faced everything before, he did not tell his family, did not explain, did not ask for permission, because there were decisions that if spoken could not be carried out. There were paths that if questioned would no longer have enough strength to continue, and therefore he chose to leave in silence, caring very little, almost nothing except himself, and a vague belief that somewhere there was an opportunity. No matter how small, it could not be seen, waiting. That night, there was no light, no farewell, only darkness and light footsteps on the dirt road that he had walked hundreds of times. But this time was different. This time each step carried a meaning he had never felt before. It was no longer the road leading home, but the road leading out of it. And in each step, there was a feeling that was very hard to name, a mixture of fear and determination. Fear because he did not know what was waiting ahead, did not know if he could survive, did not know if everything he was doing would lead to anything good or not. But at the same time, there was something else, a push that made him not stop, not turn back. A very small but enough belief to keep his feet moving forward. That staying would mean giving up completely, and that was even more frightening than anything ahead. The road to Dakar was not a prepared journey. There was no clear plan, no one to guide, only a chain of continuing steps, long stretches in the darkness, moments of stopping when the body was tired, but he could not rest long, because there was no place to stay. No money, no guarantee, only time and the growing distance between him and the place he had just left. And throughout that journey, he did not think much about the future, did not think about success, did not think about becoming anyone. He only thought about continuing to go, continuing to move forward, because turning back was no longer an option. Each step was like cutting off one more part from the past, but at the same time also moving deeper into something completely uncertain. And when Dakar gradually appeared, not as a promised place, but as a harsher reality than anything he had ever known. He understood that this journey was not the end of hardship, but only the beginning of another kind of hardship, a kind of hardship no longer sheltered by family, no longer having familiar things to hold on to, only himself and the vast world he had never belonged to. But the most important thing was not where he had arrived, but that he had not turned back. That in that moment, even though he was still very young, he had done something many people never could. He had chosen to leave everything without knowing what he would receive in return. And that very first step, in the dark night, in silence, without explanation, had opened a path that later the world would call extraordinary. But at that time it was only a chain of footsteps, full of fear, full of doubt, and full of determination that could not turn back. Dakar did not welcome him with opportunity. It welcomed him with indifference, with crowded but cold streets, with noisy neighborhoods where everyone was busy with their own lives. And for Sadio Mane, that city was not a place that opened doors, but a place that continuously closed doors in front of him. Everything here was strange, from the language, the pace of life, to the way people looked at each other, no longer the familiar glances of Bambali, but quick, cold glances that did not stop long enough to notice a skinny boy trying to find his place. He brought his dream to the academies, to the training fields, to anywhere that could be related to football. But each time like that, the first thing people saw was not potential, but appearance. Ragged clothes, a body too skinny, traces of a deprived life that he could not hide, and before he had the chance to touch the ball, many doors had already closed, not with loud rejections, but with head shakes, short sentences, impatient glances as if he did not belong there, as if he had come to the wrong place from the beginning. Each time like that, he left without reacting, without arguing, only silently stepping out, carrying one more bit of heaviness that no one saw. And when the rejections began to pile up, they were no longer separate events, but became a clear message that this world had no place for him, at least not as easily as he had once hoped. The days passed without a specific plan, without a schedule, without a certain destination, only repeated efforts and the same results, and amid all that, another problem became clearer. He had no stable place to stay, no room to return to, no small corner he could call his own. There were nights he slept thanks to others. There were nights he did not sleep, only stayed in some place until morning, waiting for a new day to begin without knowing what it would bring. Money almost did not exist. Every coin had to be calculated. Every meal was a decision. There were days he ate, there were days he did not. And the feeling of hunger was not only a physical feeling, but a prolonged state, making everything heavier, slower, but not enough to make him stop, because stopping meant admitting that everything he had done was meaningless, and that was something he could not accept. There was no one there to help, no one to stand up and say he should continue, no hand to pull him up. Everything depended on himself, and in that isolation, the feeling of being rejected became clearer than ever. Not only being rejected from an academy or a team, but being pushed out of a system he did not understand, a world he did not belong to, where others seemed to know what to do, where to go, while he was only trying step by step without a map. There were moments he stood outside a training field, looking inside, seeing other players playing, training, living the dream he was also pursuing. But the distance between them and him was not only a fence, but an entire different reality. And in those moments, the thought of going back began to appear, not as a desired choice, but as an escape from the fatigue, from the uncertainty, from the feeling of always having to prove something that no one asked for. But each time that thought appeared, it was pushed back by something else, something unclear but strong enough that if he went back, everything would end in a way he could not accept. And therefore he continued to go through the city that did not want him, continued to knock on doors that did not open, continued to live in days with nothing guaranteed, Because amid all the rejections, amid all the deprivations, there was still one thing that had not disappeared. A very small belief that if he continued long enough, if he did not stop, then maybe, somewhere, there would be a door that would not close right when he approached. And that very fragile belief was the only thing that kept him in Dakar, in a city that did not welcome him but also had not completely pushed him out. The city did not drive him away with words, it erased him with indifference. And in the connecting days, without stopping, Sadio Mane began to understand that existing in Dakar was not only a matter of opportunity, but a matter of endurance. The mornings came with nothing guaranteed for the next meal, the long noons in the heat that made the body exhausted, the evenings that ended when he did not know where he would sleep. Everything depended on luck more than plan. There were days he found a little food. There were days it was only water and silence. Hunger was no longer a temporary feeling. It became a part of the rhythm of life, something always present, slowing the steps, but not enough to stop. And amid all that, the sleeping place was never fixed. There were nights he lay on the floor of distant acquaintances. There were nights he curled up in some corner that no one noticed. There were nights he only waited for dawn without really sleeping. The body gradually got used to having no comfort. The mind gradually got used to having no support. And in that instability, another feeling grew, a feeling of invisibility. No one called his name. No one asked where he came from. No one waited for him anywhere. He walked through crowded streets like part of the flow of people, but did not belong to any of them. The training fields he once stood outside now became farther, not because of distance, but because the repetition of rejections made him no longer expect anything else. And when no one saw him anymore, no one believed in him. Continuing became a harder choice every day. There were moments he stopped longer, stood still in the middle of the street, watching the flow of people pass by, wondering if everything he was doing would lead anywhere, if leaving Bambali had been a mistake, if there was an easier path he had missed. Those thoughts did not come once. They came back many times, especially on days when the body was too tired, when hunger was clearer, when the doors continued to close without any sign of change. There were times when giving up was no longer a distant thought, but became specific, clear, almost reasonable, going back, accepting, living a simpler life, less painful, less uncertain. But each time that thought came closer, there was something that held him back, not certainty about success, not a promise from anyone, but a very hard-to-explain feeling that if he stopped now, he would carry the feeling of failure for the rest of his life. And that was heavier than hunger, heavier than fatigue. So he continued to go to places where there might be football, continued to ask, continued to wait, continued to endure doubtful looks, continued to live in days with nothing guaranteed, not because everything was changing, but because he had not allowed himself to stop. And right in that phase where nothing was clear, no success, no sign of progress, only the repetition of hardship, something else gradually formed. Not strong belief, but a quiet perseverance. A habit of continuing even when there was no clear reason. And even though no one knew of his existence, even though no one stood out there waiting, he still walked, day by day, step by step, carrying the only thing he had not lost, which was the ability to continue even when everything around showed no sign that it had meaning. Amid the repeated days of hunger and cold headshakes, there was a moment that was not grand, but different enough to slow the rhythm of disappointment. A time when the door in front of Sadio Mane did not close right when he approached. No promises, no favoritism, only a nod that allowed him to stay a little longer, to touch the ball instead of being asked to leave, to be looked at one more time instead of being forgotten immediately. And for someone who had gotten used to being eliminated before even starting, that was not a clear opportunity, but a small space where he could exist without being pushed out immediately. The training session went like any other training session, the other players confident, familiar with the pace, with the space, with the way everything worked. While he was lost, each run still carried hesitation. Each touch of the ball still had some pause, not because of lack of ability, but because he was not used to being allowed to stay, not used to not being rejected from the start. Every mistake became bigger in his mind. Every glance toward him made him wonder if he was about to be asked to leave or not. But the training still continued. No one called him out, no one stopped to eliminate him, and that very normal continuation became the most unusual thing he had ever experienced. After the training, there was no confirmation that he would be kept, no guarantee about the future. Only one thing changed. He was allowed to come back again. An unclear invitation, an uncertain opportunity, but enough to create a difference. The following days did not become easier. The hunger was still there. The sleeping place was still unstable. The worries about money was still present. But amid all that, there was one more point to hold on to. A place he could return to, a space where his existence was not completely denied. And from there, the first steps forward began to form. Not fast, not clear, but real. He learned to adapt to the pace, learned to trust his touches of the ball, learned not to withdraw every time he made a mistake. Little by little, confidence appeared, not like an explosion, but like something very fragile that could disappear at any time if things did not continue. And precisely because of that, he did not allow himself to stop. Each training became an opportunity that must be used. Each appearance was a time to prove that he deserved to stay a little longer. Not to guarantee a future, but to extend the present. Because the future was still unclear, still had nothing certain. At any time, everything could return to the old way. The doors could close again. The rejections could return, and he understood that. Understood that a small opportunity did not mean the path had opened completely. It only meant he had not been eliminated yet. And in that awareness, hope began to appear. Not a strong belief that everything would be fine, but a lighter feeling that maybe, just maybe, everything was not completely against him. That if he continued long enough, if he did not let go, then maybe there would be one more door that would not close. And in that fragility he held on to every opportunity, every training, every moment of touching the ball, as if that was the only thing keeping this journey from becoming a complete mistake. And for the first time since leaving Bambali, the feeling of moving forward was no longer completely invisible. It was still small, still uncertain, but it existed, enough for him to continue walking, not because he had seen the destination, but because finally he had found a reason not to turn back. Sadio Mane, from those scarce training sessions where he was allowed to stay, the path gradually opened in a way that was not loud, but clear enough to pull Sadio Mane farther away from Dakar. And then one day, when the opportunity came from Europe, it did not bring any certain promise. Only another step forward that he had to trade everything to seize. The journey to Red Bull Salzburg was not like what people imagine about a transformation. There was no sudden shift from darkness to light, but a slow change, where the external circumstances gradually got better. But inside, he still carried the old things. The grass fields in Austria were greener, smoother, more systematic, more organized, with people who believed in structure and discipline, completely opposite to what he had once known. And there, for the first time, Mane was not only allowed to stay, but also trusted. Given the chance to play, seen as a part of the collective, the goals began to come. Not immediately, but regularly enough for his name to appear more often. From someone no one knew, he became a player that people started mentioning. The media gradually paid attention. The numbers began to reflect his value. And along with that, material life also changed in a way he could not have imagined before. Meals were no longer a problem. A place to stay was no longer something to worry about. Every night, clothes, shoes, everything was plentiful, even excessive compared to what he once had. But amid all those changes, there was one thing that did not change. the feeling inside him did not shift at the speed of success. Every time he stepped onto the field, every time he heard his name called, every time he saw the statistics, there was a part of him still standing in Bambali, still in Dakar, still remembering clearly the days with nothing. And that very memory did not disappear when life became easier. It only changed shape, from clear pain into a quiet worry, a feeling that everything he had did not truly belong to him, that with just one mistake, one injury, one wrong decision, everything could collapse as quickly as it had arrived. And therefore, even though success began to appear, even though everything on the outside showed he was moving up, inside there still existed a constant vigilance, a state that did not allow him to fully relax, did not allow him to believe that everything had stabilized. Each goal was not only joy, but also a temporary confirmation that he still deserved to be here. Each match was not only an opportunity to show himself, but a test he was not allowed to fail. And that very thing made success not bring the feeling of freedom, as people think. It brought responsibility, brought pressure to maintain, to continue, to never return to the starting point. When his name began to spread wider, when bigger clubs started to pay attention, when his value was talked about in bigger numbers, the world looked in and saw an upward story, a journey from poverty to success. But they did not see the rest. The part where every evening, when the noise was gone, when the lights were off, he still carried the feeling that everything could disappear, that the past was not something that had passed, but something always standing behind, waiting, and in that state, the feeling of safety became a luxury, not because he did not have enough, but because he had never truly believed he could keep it. And even though his steps had taken him to places that before only existed in imagination, even though life had changed in a way many called a dream, for Mane, that was not the end of the journey, but only another phase where he had to learn how to exist in success without losing the vigilance that had helped him survive. And precisely because of that, success came, but freedom did not. Because when you have grown up in a world where everything can be taken away at any moment, believing that everything will stay becomes harder than anything else. When stepping into the peak period at Liverpool FC, everything around Sadio Mane seemed to reach an intensity he had never experienced before. Not only the speed of the matches, not only the pressure of a big league like the Premier League, but the focus of the whole world on every run, every touch of the ball, every moment he was present on the field. From a player who was noticed, he became an indispensable part of a team competing at the highest level. The goals were no longer just personal achievements, but moments that shaped matches, shaped seasons, shaped the history of a club. And when the titles began to come, when the Champions League was lifted, when the Premier League finally belonged to Liverpool after many years of waiting, his name was no longer just a name in the lineup, but became an icon, not only of the club but also of something bigger, a representative for an entire continent, proof that from forgotten places, people could still appear at the peak of the world. And right at that moment, another type of pressure began to form. No longer the pressure of proving himself, but the pressure of not being allowed to drop, not being allowed to become normal. Because when you become an icon, everything you do no longer belongs to you alone. Each match was not just a match, but a message sent to millions of people watching. Each time you did not play well was not just a bad day, but a question mark placed on everything you represented. And for Mane, that was never said directly, but was always present in every moment, in the way fans looked at him, in the way the media talked about him, in the way every action was analyzed, compared, evaluated. And amid all that, he was no longer a simple individual. He became an image, a standard that others placed on him, and that brought a responsibility that could not be put down. In Senegal, his name was not only attached to football, but attached to hope, to pride, to a story that many saw as their own. And every time he stepped onto the field, it was not just Liverpool playing, but an entire nation watching, waiting, placing faith in every run. And that very expectation made everything heavier, because there was no space for mistakes, no room for fatigue, no time to stop and ask if he needed rest or not. Form had to be maintained, the image had to be kept solid, the attitude had to always be proper, because with just one loose moment, everything could be questioned. And in such an environment, success no longer brought comfort. It became a standard that you had to continue achieving, not once, but continuously, from one match to the next, from one season to the next. And that created a state in which, even when you were at the peak, you still did not feel you had arrived, because there was always something ahead demanding more, demanding better, demanding more perfect. And for Mane, who had grown up in deprivation, who had learned not to trust stability, living in a world where everything could change after just one match made the feeling of safety even more distant. Each time stepping onto the field was not only an opportunity, but a time to hold on to everything that had been achieved, and in that process, some part inside him continued to be stretched. Between becoming the person the world expected and the person he truly was, between meeting expectations and keeping himself, and even though from the outside everything seemed perfect, from titles, form, to recognition, inside there still existed non-stop pressure, a feeling that if he just slowed down a little, if he just did not meet the set standard, everything could start sliding down. And that very thing made the phase called the peak. Not a place where he found relief, but a place where he had to carry more, run more, endure more, because when you become an icon, you no longer have the right to be weak, and that is a price that not everyone sees. The pressure did not stop at the European stadiums. It followed Sadio Mane back to where it all began, where every run of his was not only seen through the eyes of fans, but through the hope of an entire nation that had waited too long for a moment like that. And when the AFC 2022 final approached, the atmosphere around was no longer like a simple sports tournament. It became something heavier, bigger, spreading out from the grass field into every street, every house, every small corner of Senegal, where every eye was directed at one team, and in that team, every eye stopped at him, not because he wanted that, but because he could not avoid it. Because when you become an icon, there are moments when you no longer represent yourself. You represent all the people who have placed faith in you. And that night was one of those moments, the stadium bright, the noise rising high, but inside, everything slowed down. Each second passing carried the weight of years of waiting, of previous failures, of dreams that had never been fulfilled. And when the match began, it was no longer a normal competition. It was the collision between expectation and reality, between what everyone wanted and what football could bring. And in the first minutes, when the opportunity came, when the ball was placed in front of his feet in a position where millions believed he would not miss, time seemed to stop, not because that moment was bigger than any other, but because it carried so much meaning, a shot that could open history or prolong more years of waiting. And in that second, pressure was no longer an abstract concept. It became a clear feeling, present in every heartbeat, in every breath, in the way the body reacted to the space around. And when the shot was taken, when the ball did not go into the net, a short silence appeared, not because the stadium was quiet, but because inside him something fell, not faith, but a part of the certainty he had carried throughout the match. And from that moment, everything became harder, not only tactically, but psychologically, because now he was not only playing to win, but also facing himself, facing the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he would not fulfill what the whole country was waiting for. And as the match dragged on, as each minute passed without difference, the pressure did not decrease. It accumulated, piled up, heavier, deeper. And when the match entered the penalty shootout, where everything was decided in short but absolute moments, he once again stood in front of the ball, but this time, it was no longer an opening opportunity, but a closing one, no longer a choice among many, but the final choice. And in that second, there was no guarantee, Nothing certain. Only him, the ball, and everything that had led here, from Bambali, from Dakar, from the days no one knew him, from the rejections, from the pressure at Liverpool, all converging in one moment he could not step back from. And when the shot was taken, when the ball went into the net, when the noise exploded, when teammates ran over, when an entire nation burst with joy, the result was not only a victory, it was the release of millions of people, the fulfillment of a journey that had lasted many years, the moment when Senegal stood on top of Africa for the first time. And amid all that, he was not only a player who scored the decisive goal, he was the one who carried the weight of an entire nation and did not let it fall. But even in victory, even when the title was lifted, the feeling inside was not as simple as pure joy, because he knew clearly how thin the line between victory and defeat was in that moment, that if things had gone just a little differently, the story would have been completely different, and that very awareness made the victory deeper, not because it was perfect, but because it had come after facing the clearest possibility of failure. And therefore that night was not only the night of a title, it was the night he proved that even when standing before the greatest pressure, when there was no space for mistakes, when every eye was on him, he could still step up, do what needed to be done, and bring back not only a trophy, but something bigger, a belief that the years of endurance, the fears, the pressures were not meaningless, that they could lead to a moment where everything converged, not to erase the past, but to show that he had gone through it and still stood firm. But football does not allow a story to end with victory. It always continues, always sets another challenge, and sometimes that challenge does not come from the opponent, but from the body itself, from the limit that no one can overcome forever. And for Sadio Mane, that moment came at a time he never wanted, right before the World Cup 2022. When an entire nation once again placed faith in him, when every eye once again turned toward him as the one who could lead them farther, when everything that had happened at AFCO was still fresh, like a promise that the miracle could repeat. But this time, what came was not an opportunity, but a crack in the very body he had trusted for many years. The injury did not come like a big collision, not a clearly recognizable moment. It came silently, like many other things in his life, starting from a feeling of unease, a pain he tried to ignore, because there were times when you did not allow yourself to be weak, did not allow yourself to stop, especially when an entire country was waiting. But the body did not follow the will. It did not care about titles, did not care about responsibility. It only reacted according to its own limits. And when the diagnosis was given, when the unavoidable reality became clear, that he would not be able to play, not because he did not want to, but because he could not, everything around seemed to slow down once again, like the moment before the penalty at AFC. But this time, there was no chance to fix it, no second shot, no way to step up and change the result. Only one single truth: that he would stand outside, watching his national team enter the biggest tournament in the world without him, and for a person who had gotten used to enduring, used to continuing no matter the circumstances, this was another type of challenge. A type of helplessness he had never experienced this way, because before, no matter how difficult, he could still run, still play, still do something. But this time, everything was beyond his control, and that made the feeling heavier. Not only because of the physical pain, but because of the mental pain of knowing he could not help, that all he had prepared, all he had endured to get here, could not be used, while in Senegal, the disappointment did not need to be spoken to be felt. It was present in the way people talked about the tournament, in the way they mentioned his name with a short silence, in the way hope was replaced by worry, and he knew that, not through the press, but through the feeling of connection he always carried with his homeland. And that very thing made everything harder, because this was not only missing a tournament, but being unable to be there when people needed him the most. There were days he followed the matches watched his teammates play, watched the moments where he should have been present. And in those moments, the feeling of helplessness became clearer than ever. Not because he was not good enough, but because, for the first time, the body itself had set a limit he could not overcome, and in that confrontation, something else gradually appeared. An awareness he had avoided for many years, that no matter how strong the will, no matter how great the perseverance, there were still things that could not be controlled. There were times you had to stop not because you chose to, but because you were forced to. And for a person who had built his life on never stopping, that was not only a challenge, but a change in the way he saw himself. That he was not invincible, that there were limits he had to learn to accept. And right in that moment, when there was no longer a grass field to run on, no match to focus on, no pressure to perform, he was forced to face another question. Not about success or failure, but about who he was when he could not do what he had done his whole life, and that question did not have an immediate answer. It just stayed there, silently, like many other things in his journey, waiting to be understood, waiting to be accepted. After the days of having to stand outside because of injury, when the body gradually recovered and the rhythm of football life returned, Sadio Mane stepped into a new phase at Bayern Munich with no small expectations, not only from the club, but also from what he had built before. But the new environment was not a place where everything automatically worked the old way. The pace was different, the system was different, the demands were different, and in the process of adapting, what had once helped him stand firm began to be challenged in ways not easy to recognize from the start. Form was no longer stable as before. The plays were no longer natural like at Liverpool. The decisive moments no longer came clearly, and each match passed without reaching the familiar standard. The pressure accumulated a little more, not only from the outside but from inside, because for a person used to maintaining the highest level, even small differences became significant, and in a competitive environment like Bayern, where every position could be replaced, every mistake was noticed. There was not much space to adjust slowly. The tension began to appear in every training session, every match, every moment of communication with teammates. And in that process, the relationship with Leroy Sané became a point where the accumulated pressures found an outlet, not because of a single cause, but because many small factors gradually piled up. Misunderstandings on the field, situations not handled as expected, emotions held back too long without release. And then a moment happened. Not something anyone expected, not the image he had built for many years, but an explosive reaction. An action that went beyond the control he had always held tightly. And when that happened, it was not only an incident between two players, it immediately became a bigger story. A story talked about, analyzed, evaluated from many angles. Because when a person seen as an icon of calmness and discipline showed a moment of losing control, that contrast created a stronger impact than any other action. The reaction from the club, from the media, from the fans came quickly, with no silence for everything to settle down. And for Mané, that was not only facing external consequences, but also facing himself, facing the image he had tried to maintain, facing the standard he had set for himself, and realizing that even after going through so much, after building so much, there were still moments when everything could be shaken, not because of lack of will, but because the pressure had accumulated to a point where it found an outlet in a way no one could control. The consequences did not stop at criticism. They affected his position in the team, the way he was perceived, the decisions related to the future, and in that context, the story was no longer just about one action, but about what led to it, about the months when pressure was not released, about the incomplete adaptation process, about moving from a familiar environment to one that demanded differently, and the way all those things combined, creating a moment where he could not keep control as before. And in that event, one thing became clearer, that even though he had reached the peak, even though he had overcome many challenges, he was still human, still had limits, still had times when he could not keep everything in check, and facing that was not easy, because it was not only fixing the mistake, but accepting that the perfect image others saw did not always reflect the entire person inside. And from there, the next journey was not only returning to form, but finding balance again. Not only on the grass field, but in the way he faced pressure, expectations, and the parts of himself that he had always kept in silence before. After all the fluctuations, the moments when the image was questioned, the pressures from the new environment and what had accumulated inside, there was one thing in Sadio Mané's life that had never changed. That was the way he lived, not the way he played, not the way he appeared in front of the media, but the way he existed when there were no lights, when there was no cheering, when everything returned to a slower rhythm, where the value of a person was not measured by titles or contracts, but by what they kept for themselves. And in the world of football, where wealth often went with showiness, where supercars, luxurious villas, expensive trips became symbols of success, Manet chose a different path, not because he could not have all those things, but because he had never truly wanted them. His life, even when he had reached an income level many could not imagine, still kept an almost unchanged simplicity. Daily choices not dominated by the need to show off, no need to prove to the world that he had succeeded through consumption. Because for him, success had never been tied to owning more, but tied to not forgetting what he once lacked, and that very memory, the memory of Bambali, of the days without electricity, without clean water, without opportunities, became what shaped the way he used what he had. When others looked at assets and thought of enjoyment, he looked at it and thought of the places that still had nothing. The children still growing up in circumstances like he once did, the families still facing difficult choices every day, and from there, a large part of what he earned did not stay with him. It went back to where he started. Bambali was not only a memory, it was a present part he always carried. The construction projects were not temporary actions, but a long process, step by step. Schools built so children did not have to stop at the limits he once experienced. Hospitals set up so families did not have to lose loved ones just because of lack of medical conditions. Support for daily life, helping the community stand firmer before everyday difficulties. And all that was not done to create an image. Not promoted like a campaign, but happened silently, like the way he had lived, not needing to be seen to have meaning. Because for him, giving was not a moral choice but something almost unavoidable, as if everything he had did not completely belong to him but was part of a larger circle where what he received had to be given back. And when looking at the way he lived, the simplicity was not a rejection of success, but the way he kept himself from being swept away by it. The way he kept a part of Bombali inside him, not as a burden, but as a constant reminder of who he was and why he started. In a world where everything could change quickly, where fame could come and go, where what is praised today could be forgotten tomorrow, keeping a fixed point became more important than anything else, and for Manet, that fixed point was not on the grass field, not in titles, but in the way he chose to live, a way of living that did not depend on how much he had, but on what he did with what he had. And right in that choice, one could find the answer to everything that had led him here, that his journey was not only going farther, but returning in a different way, not to stay, but to ensure that others had the chance to go farther, and in everything he had been through. From loss, from silence, from pressure, to the moments of losing control, this still did not change, because it did not come from circumstances but from the person he was, a person who had learned to live with very little, and therefore, even with everything, he still did not feel the need to change that. After everything that had happened, after the years when life did not follow a clear, straight line, after the times standing at the peak and the times having to step back in silence, there was one thing that Sadio Mané had never said directly, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because there were truths that could not be expressed simply in words. They existed in the way he lived, in the choices he made, in the things he did when no one was looking, and if one looked long enough, if one listened not only to what he said, but also to what he did not say, it could be seen clearly that his life and career had never been only about football. The goals, the titles, all those things were only the surface of a deeper journey, a journey that began from the days with nothing, from the memories he could not erase, and those very memories became the real driving force behind everything. Not the desire for fame, not the wish for recognition, but a very specific, very clear fear. The fear of returning to where he once was, where everything could collapse after just one night, where deprivation was not a phase, but a normal state. And even though life had changed, even though he had gone farther than anyone could imagine when looking at the little boy in Bambali back then, that fear did not disappear. It only changed how it showed, from worrying about meals to not allowing himself to stop, not allowing himself to be satisfied, not allowing himself to think that it was enough, because in his mind, enough was a dangerous concept, a point where, if touched, everything could start sliding down, and precisely because of that, every time he stepped onto the field, every time he trained, every time he continued after a failure, it was not only to win, but to keep distance from the past, to ensure that the path he had taken would not be reversed, but beside that fear, there was something else, a responsibility he could not put down, responsibility to family, to the people who were there when he had nothing, to the people who believed when there was no reason to believe, and even farther, responsibility to his homeland, to Bambali, to Senegal, to the children growing up in circumstances like he once did, the people who looked at him not only as a player, but as a possibility, proof that one could go farther than what they saw every day, and in that awareness, success was no longer a personal goal. It became a tool, a means to create something bigger, to open doors that did not exist before, to make the path clearer for those who came after. And when looking back at everything, the way he saw success was not like the way the world usually defined it. It did not lie in the number of titles, not in assets, but in whether what he did created a difference, changed something for others or not. And precisely because of that, even though he had achieved so much, he did not see his journey as completed, because there were still things not resolved. There were still gaps that no victory could completely fill. And perhaps that was the truth everyone had felt but had never heard clearly, that he had never truly run to reach a destination. He ran so as not to return. He played football not to become a legend, but to keep a promise to himself that what he had been through would not repeat in the old way. And in that continuation, in not stopping even when he had everything, one could see clearly his true self, not the perfect image. The world saw but a person carrying the past, carrying fear, carrying responsibility, and choosing to live with all that, not to escape, but to turn them into reasons to continue. The story of Sadio Mane does not make people admire in a loud way, but leaves a very deep sadness, because the more one goes through his journey, the more one realizes that there are people who never truly get to rest, even when they have reached the peak. From the days in Bambali with the sudden death of his father, to the hungry and invisible nights in Dakar, then the moment standing before the penalty at AFC on 2022 carrying an entire nation, to the helplessness of watching the World Cup pass because of injury. All were not just events, but layers of pressure piled on each other, creating a person who always had to continue even when there was no choice. And what makes this story especially heartbreaking is that even when he had everything, money, titles, global recognition, he still lived like a person who had never escaped the fear of losing everything, that showed clearly through the way he rejected a luxurious life, chose to build schools, hospitals in his homeland, as if he was trying to repair a part of the past he could not return to. For American audiences, where success is often measured by assets and fame, This story offers a different perspective, that success, if not accompanied by meaning, is only a temporary state, and that what a person has been through will always remain in ways no one sees. The lesson here is not to become extraordinary like Meunier, but to understand that true value lies in the way we face difficulties, the way we use what we have to create a difference, and more importantly, not forgetting where we came from, because that very thing, not titles, is what defines a person. If Sadio Mané's story makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate the journey of a man who has never stopped stepping forward, even though he has carried too much burden. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the halo that not everyone dares to tell.